Hi, my name's Larissa. Today is Sunday, December 11th, 2022, and we are reading To a God Unknown by John Steinbeck. And I think we're going to finish it today. There's 2 chapters left. Quite a book, isn't it? You've been following along. Quite a book. Chapter 25. Joseph tightened his cinch and untied the hair rope from the old olive tree, and then he mounted his horse and turned him in the direction of the ranch. The night had fallen while he was in the priest's house. It was very dark before the moonrise. Along the street of Our Lady, a few lights shone from the windows, blurred by the moisture on the insides of the glass. Before Joseph had gone 100 feet into the cold night, Juanito rode up beside him. "I want to go with you, senor," he said firmly. Joseph sighed. "No, Juanito, I told you before. You've had nothing to eat. Alice has supper for you, waiting and hot." "No, thank you," Joseph said. "I'll be riding on." "But the night is cold," insisted Juanito. "Come in and have a drink anyway." Joseph looked at the dull light shining through the windows of the saloon. "I will have a drink," he said. They tied their horses to the hitching post and went through the swinging doors. No one was there but the bartender, sitting on a high stool behind the bar. He looked up as the two entered and climbed from his stool and polished a spot on the bar. "Mr. Wayne," he said in greeting, "I haven't seen you for a long time." "I don't get into town often. Whiskey." "And whiskey for me," Juanito said. "I heard you saved some of your cows, Mr. Wayne." "Yes, a few." "You're better off than some. My brother-in-law lost every single head." And he told how the ranches were deserted and all the cattle dead, and he told how the people had gone away from the town of Our Lady. "No business now," he said. "I don't sell a dozen drinks a day. Sometimes a man comes in for a bottle. People don't like to drink together now," he said. "They take a bottle home and drink alone." Joseph tasted his empty glass and set it down. "Fill it," he said. "I guess we'll be having a desert from now on." "Have one yourself." The bartender filled his glass. "When the rain comes, they'll all be back. I'd set a barrel of whiskey in the road, free, if the rain would come tomorrow." Joseph drank his whiskey and stared at the bartender questioningly. "If the rain doesn't come at all, what then?" he demanded. "I don't know, Mr. Wayne, and I won't know. If it doesn't come pretty soon, I'll have to go too. I'd put a whole barrel of whiskey out on the porch, free for everyone, if the storms would come." Joseph put down his glass. "Good night," he said. "I hope you get your wish." Juanito followed him closely. "Alice has dinner hot for you," he said. Joseph stopped in the road and lifted his head to look at the misty stars. "The drink has made me hungry. I'll go." Alice met them at the door of her father's house. "I'm glad you came," she said. "The dinner is nothing, but it will be a change. My father and mother have gone visiting to San Luis Obispo since Juanito was back." She was excited at the importance of her guest. In the kitchen, she seated the 2 men at a snow-white table and served them with red beans and red wine and thin tortillas and fluffy rice. "You haven't eaten my beans, Mr. Wayne, for a long time." Joseph smiled. "They are good. Elizabeth said they were the best in the world." Alice caught her breath. "I'm glad you speak of her." Her eyes filled with tears. "Why should I not speak of her?" "I thought it might give you too much pain." "Be silent, Alice," Juanito said gently. "Our guest is here to eat." Joseph ate his plate of beans and wiped up the juice with the tortilla and accepted another helping. "He will see the baby?" Alice asked timidly. "His grandfather calls him Chango, but that is not his name." "He is asleep," Juanito said. "Wake him and bring him here." She carried out the sleepy child and stood him in front of Joseph. "See? His eyes will be gray. That's blue for Juanito and black for me." Joseph looked at the child searchingly. "He is strong and handsome. I'm glad of that. He knows the name of 10 trees, and Juanito is going to get him a pony when the good years come." Juanito nodded with pleasure. "He is a Chango," he said self-consciously. Joseph stood up from the table. "What is his name?" Alice blushed, and then she took the sleepy baby. "He is your namesake," she said. "His name is Joseph. Will you give him a blessing?" Joseph looked at her incredulously. "A blessing from me?" "Yes," he said quickly, "I will." He took the little boy in his arms and brushed back the black hair from the forehead, and he kissed the forehead. "Grow strong," he said. "Grow big and strong." Alice took the baby back, and though he were not quite her own, as though he weren't quite her own anymore. "I'll put him to bed, and then we will go to the sitting room." But Joseph strode quickly to the door. "I must go now," he said. "Thank you for dinner. Thank you for my namesake." And when Alice started to protest, Juanito silenced her. He followed Joseph to the yard and felt the cinch for him and put the bit in the horse's mouth. "I'm afraid to have you go, Señor," Juanito protested. "Why should you be afraid? See, the moon is coming up." Juanito looked and cried excitedly, "Look! There's a ring around the moon." Joseph laughed harshly and climbed into the saddle. "There's a saying in this country, I learned it long ago. In the dry year, all signs fail. Good night, Juanito." Juanito walked a moment beside the horse. "Goodbye, Señor. See you. Take care." He patted the horse and stepped back, and he looked after Joseph until he had disappeared into the dim moonlit night. Joseph turned his back on the moon and rode away from it into the west. The land was unsubstantial under the misty, strained light. The dry trees seemed shapes of thicker mist. He left the town and took the river road, and his contact with the town dropped behind him. He smelled the peppery dust that rose under the horse's hoofs, but he couldn't see it. Away in the dark north there was a faint flicker of aurora borealis, rarely seen so far south. The cold, stony moon rose high and followed him. The mountains seemed edged with phosphorus, and a pale, cold light, like a glowworm's light, seemed to shine through the skin of the land. The night had a quality of memory. Joseph remembered how his father had given him the blessing. Now he thought of it, he wished he had given the same blessing to his namesake, and he remembered that there had been a time when the land was drenched with his father's spirit, so that every rock and bush was close and dear. He remembered how damp the earth felt and smelled, and how the grass roots wove a fabric just under the surface. The horse plodded steadily on, head down, resting some of his head's weight on the bridle. Joseph's mind went wearily among the days of the past, and every event was colored like the night. He was aloof from the land now. He thought, some change is beginning. It will not be long before some new thing is on the way. And as he thought it, the wind began to blow. He heard it coming out of the west, heard it whisking a long time before it struck him. A sharp, steady wind, carrying the refuse of dead trees and bushes along the ground. It was acrid with dust. The tiny rocks it carried stung Joseph's eyes. As he rode, the wind increased, and long veils of dust swept down the moonlit hills. Ahead, a coyote barked a staccato question, and another answered from the other side of the road. Then the two voices drew together into a high, shrieking giggle that rode down the wind. A third sharp question from a third direction, and all three giggled. Joseph shivered a little. They're hungry, he thought. There's so little carrion left to eat. Then he heard a calf moan in the high brush beside the road, and he turned his horse and spurred it up and broke through the brittle brushes. In a moment he came to a little clearing in the brush. A dead cow lay on its side, and a skinny calf butted frantically to find a teat. The coyotes laughed again and went away to wait. Joseph dismounted and walked to the dead cow. Its hip was a mountain peak, and its ribs were like the long water scars on the hillsides. It had died finally, when bits of dry brush would not support it any more. The calf tried to get away, but it was too weak with hunger. It stumbled and fell heavily and floundered on the ground, trying to get up again. Joseph untied his riata and roped the skinny legs together. Then he lifted the calf in front of the saddle and mounted behind it. "Now come for your dinner," he called to the coyotes. "Eat the cow. Pretty soon there will be no more to eat." He glanced over his shoulder at the bone-white moon sailing and hovering in the blown dust. In a little while he said, "It will fly down and eat the world." As he rode on, his hand explored the lean calf. His fingers followed the sharp ribs and felt the bony legs. The calf tried to rest its head against the horse's shoulder, and its head bobbled weakly with the movement. At last they topped the rise, and Joseph saw the house of the ranch, bleached and huddled. The blades of the windmill shone faintly in the moonlight. It was a view half obscured, for the white dust filled the air, and the wind drove fiercely down the valley. Joseph turned up the hill to avoid the houses, and he went up toward the black grove. The moon sank over the western hills, and the land was blotted out of sight. The wind howled down the slopes and cried in the dry branches of the trees. The horse lowered its head against the wind. Joseph could make out the pine grove darkly as he approached it, for a streak of dawn was coming over the hills. He could hear the tossing branches and the swish of the needles combing the wind, and the moan of limbs rubbing together. The black branches tossed against the dawn. The horse walked wearily in among the trees, and the wind stayed outside. It seemed quiet in the gray place, more so because of the noise around it. Joseph climbed down and lifted the calf to the ground, and he unsaddled the horse and put a double measure of rolled barley in the feed box. At last he turned reluctantly to the rock. The light had come in secretly, and the sky and the trees and the rock were gray. Joseph walked slowly across the glade and knelt by the little stream, and the stream was gone. He sat quietly down and put his hand in the bed. The gravel was still damp, but no water moved out of the little cave any more. Joseph was tired. The wind howling above the grove and the stealthy drought were too much to fight. He thought, now it is over. I think I knew it would be. The dawn brightened. Pale streaks of sunlight shone on the dust clouds that filled the air. Joseph stood up and went to the rock and stroked it. The moss was growing brittle already. The green had begun to fade out of it. I might climb up on top and sleep a little, he thought. And then the sun shone over the hills, and the shaft of its light cut through the pine trunks and threw a blinding spot on the ground. Joseph heard a little struggle behind him where the calf tried to loosen its legs from the riata loops. Suddenly Joseph thought of the old man on the cliff top. His eyes shone with excitement. This might be the way, he cried. He carried the calf to the stream side, held its head out over the dry bed, and cut its throat with his pocket knife, and its blood ran down the stream bed and reddened the gravel and fell into the bucket. It was over too soon. So little, Joseph thought sadly. Poor, starved creature, it had so little blood. He watched the red stream stop running and sink into the gravel. And while he watched, it lost its brightness and turned dark. He sat beside the dead calf and thought again of the old man. His secret was for him. He said, it won't work for me. The sun lost its brilliance and sheathed itself in thin clouds. Joseph regarded the dying moss and the circle of trees. This is gone now. I am all alone. And then a panic fell upon him. Why should I stay in this dead place? He thought of the green canyon over the Puerto Suelo. Now that he was no longer supported by the rock and the stream, he was horribly afraid of the creeping drought. I'll go, he cried suddenly. He picked up his saddle and ran across the glade with it. The horse raised its head and snorted with fear. Joseph lifted the heavy saddle, and as the tapadero struck the horse's side, it reared, plunged, and broke its tether. The saddle was flung back on Joseph's chest. He stood smiling a little while he watched the horse run out of the glade and away, and now the calm redescended upon him, and his fear was gone. I'll climb up on the rock and sleep a while, he said. He felt a little pain on his wrist and lifted his arm to look. A saddle buckle had cut him. His wrist and palm were bloody. As he looked at the little wound, the calm grew more secure about him, and the aloofness cut him off from the grove and from all the world. Of course, he said, I will climb on the rock. He worked his way carefully up its steep side until at last he lay in the deep, soft moss on the rock's top. When he had rested a few minutes, he took out his knife again and carefully, gently opened the vessels of his wrist. The pain was sharp at first, but in a moment its sharpness dulled. He watched the bright blood cascading over the moss, and he heard the shouting of the wind around the grove. The sky was growing gray, and time passed, and Joseph grew gray too. He lay on his side with his wrist outstretched and looked down the long black mountain range of his body. Then his body grew huge, and light. It arose into the sky, and out of it came the streaking rain. I should have known, he whispered, I am the rain. And yet he looked dully down the mountains of his body, where the hills fell to an abyss. He felt the driving rain and heard it whipping down, pattering on the ground. He saw the hills grow dark with moisture. Then a lancing pain shot through the heart of the world. I am the land, he said, and I am the rain. The grass will grow out of me in a little while. And the storm thickened and covered the world with darkness and with the rush of waters. 26. The rain swept through the valley. In a few hours, the little streams were boiling down from the hillsides and falling into the river of Our Lady. The earth turned black and drank the water until it could hold no more. The river itself churned among the boulders and raced for the pass in the hills. Father Angelo was in his little house sitting among the parchment books of the holy pictures when the rain started. He was reading La Vida del San Bartolomeo. Bartolomeo. The life of St. Bartholomew. But when the pattering on the roof began, he laid the book down. Through the hours, he heard the roaring of the water over the valley and the shouting of the river. Now and then he went to his door and looked out. All the first night he stayed awake and listened happily to the commotion of the rain, and he was glad when he remembered how he had prayed for it. At dusk of the second night, the storm was unabated. Father Angelo went into his church and replaced the candles before the Virgin and did his duties to her. And then he stood in the dark doorway of the church and looked out on the sodden land. He saw Manuel Gomez hurry past carrying a wet coyote pelt, and soon afterward Jose Alvarez trotted by with a deer's horns in his hands. Father Angelo covered himself with the shadow of the doorway. Mrs. Gutierrez splashed through the puddles, holding an old moth-eaten bearskin in her arms. The priest knew what would take place in this rainy night. A hot anger flared up in him. "Only let them start it, and I'll stop them," he said. He went back into the church and took a heavy crucifix from a cupboard and retired with it to his house. Once in his sitting room, he coated the crucifix with phosphorus so that it might be better seen in the dark, and then he sat down and listened for the expected sounds. It was difficult to hear them over the splash and the battering of the rain, but at last he made them out, the throb of the bass strings of the guitars pounding and pounding. Still Father Angelo sat and listened, and a strange reluctance to interfere came over him. A low chanting of many voices joined the rhythm of the strings rising and falling. The priest could see in his mind how the people were dancing, beating the soft earth to slush with their bare feet. He knew how they would be wearing the skins of animals, although they didn't know why they wore them. The pounding rhythm grew louder and more insistent, and the chanting voices shrill and hysterical. "They'll be taking off their clothes," the priest whispered, "and they'll roll around in the mud. They'll be rutting like pigs in the mud." He put on a heavy cloak and took up his crucifix and opened the door. The rain was roaring on the ground, and in the distance the river crashed on its stones. The guitars throbbed feverishly, and the chant had become a bestial snarling. Father Angelo thought he could hear the bodies splashing in the mud. Slowly, he closed the door again and took off his cloak and laid down his phosphorus cross. "I couldn't see them in the dark," he said. "They'd all get away in the dark." And then he confessed to himself, "They wanted the rain so, poor children. I'll preach again them on Sunday. I'll give everybody a little penance." He went back to his chair and sat listening to the rush of the waters. He thought of Joseph Wayne, and he saw the pale eyes suffering because of the land's want. "That man must be very happy now," Father Angelo said to himself. Isn't it beautiful? Joseph Wayne. Yeshua among us, sacrificing himself, steward of the land. He was right the whole time. And Father Angelo was correct too. He was happy finally. This book gets me every time. I hope you enjoyed it.